There is a continent where the map never sits still. In just 200 years, Europe has seen over 100 borders drawn, erased, and redrawn again. Whole empires vanished overnight, tiny nations sprang out of nowhere, and 2 world wars redrew the rules of civilization itself. What if I told you the last 200 years of Europe is the single most chaotic, action-packed story in human history? Today, we're going to squeeze 2 centuries of madness into a story so wild it'll feel like watching a thriller. Think about it. Europe went from kings and queens ruling by divine right to revolutions, dictators, genocides, Cold War standoffs, and eventually the rise of something no one thought possible, a continent trying to unite. But here's the challenge. How do you even begin to explain all of that in 5 minutes? It's not just history. It's the origin story of the modern world. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at Europe the same way again. Let's rewind to the early 1800s. Europe was a ticking time bomb. Monarchs held tight to their thrones while revolutions exploded like fireworks. Napoleon marched across the continent like a storm, rewriting entire governments at gunpoint. For the average person, the ground beneath your feet didn't just shift, it shattered, and it didn't stop. Europe would spend the next 200 years trapped in a loop of chaos, wars so big they consumed the world, ideologies so powerful they split nations in two, and a constant tug-of-war between freedom and tyranny. Every generation thought it couldn't possibly get worse, until it did. The engine of this chaos? The Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, steam and steel turned Europe into the center of global power. Cities exploded with growth, factories belched smoke, and new wealth poured in, but so did inequality. It was progress at lightning speed, but it came with riots, revolts, and brutal working conditions. Then came the First World War. Entire empires, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, Tsarist Russia, collapsed in flames. Millions dead. Borders erased. And when the dust settled, the Treaty of Versailles left wounds that would fester into something even worse. Because 2 decades later, Europe found itself in World War II, the bloodiest conflict in human history. Hitler's rise, the Holocaust, cities bombed into ash, and finally the continent split in two. And that split wasn't just physical, it was ideological. The Cold War carved Europe into East and West, communism versus capitalism. Berlin became the front line of a global standoff, with a literal wall slicing families apart. Missiles, spies, propaganda. The whole continent was living on the edge of nuclear fire. But in the middle of all this destruction, something unexpected was brewing. Out of the rubble of war, nations that had spent centuries fighting each other started to whisper a radical idea. What if instead of fighting, we actually work together? This was the birth of what would eventually become the European Union. Not an empire, not a monarchy, but a fragile experiment in unity. And then, the moment that still gives chills today. November 9th, 1989. After decades of Cold War tension, the Berlin Wall, that giant concrete scar dividing East and West, crumbled. Crowds climbed over, families hugged through the cracks, soldiers dropped their weapons, and suddenly Europe was reborn. It wasn't just the fall of a wall, it was the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the end of half a century of fear, and the start of Europe's boldest chapter yet, trying to stand together in peace after centuries of tearing itself apart. So what do we learn from these 200 years of madness? Europe reinvented itself again and again, from monarchies to republics, from world wars to uneasy peace, from bitter enemies to unlikely partners. The borders might keep shifting, but the story is always the same. This continent refuses to stand still. Today, Europe faces new challenges: migration, energy crises, political divides. But history tells us something important. Chaos isn't the end of Europe. It's the fuel that keeps transforming it. Now here's the big question. Which moment of European history do you think changed the world the most? The World Wars, the Berlin Wall, or the creation of the EU? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more insane stories from history told at full speed, smash that subscribe button. This is history like you've never seen before.